Tanya never expected a single moment to stop her in her tracks. She had spent years moving through life like background noise, always there, always working, but never really seen. To most, she was just another face behind a diner counter, someone who existed to take orders and clear tables. But that day, something different happened. Something that made her breath catch, her hands tremble, and her world shift in a way she never thought possible. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't loud or dramatic. But it was enough to make her realize just how invisible she had been, until someone, for the first time in years, truly saw her. And it all started with a stranger at table 9. The alarm buzzed before dawn, cutting through the silence of her small apartment. Tanya reached for it with a tired hand, her body protesting after another restless night. She had no time to linger. There was breakfast to make, school supplies to check, and a bus to catch. Her teenage son, Malcolm, stirred under his blanket as she placed a plate of toast and eggs on the table. He was growing fast, too fast. His dreams stretched beyond their cramped home, beyond the long hours she spent at Mason's diner. He talked about college, about moving to a city where opportunities weren't just words. She nodded and smiled, never letting him see the numbers in her head, the calculations she ran every night to make ends meet. She tucked a few extra dollars into his backpack for lunch, knowing she'd have to cut back somewhere else. Maybe less coffee this week. Maybe skipping dinner one night. It didn't matter. He mattered. By the time she stepped into the diner, the scent of burnt coffee and grease clung to the air. The doorbell chimed as she walked in, but no one looked up. The uniform felt stiff against her skin, always a little too tight in places that made long shifts even harder. She adjusted the apron, tied her hair back, and got to work. Mason's had been the same for years. The same cracked menus, the same flickering light above booth 7, the same regulars who came in at the same time every day. Some were kind, offering polite nods and quiet thanks. Others barely acknowledged her, tossing orders her way without a glance. She had mastered the art of being invisible. Customers spoke over her, around her, never to her. They complained about the service while she stood right there, wiping down their tables. Some left messes so careless, so thoughtless. She wondered if they even realized a person would have to clean up after them. She remembered one businessman who never looked up from his phone, ordering in clipped sentences before leaving behind a disaster of spilled ketchup and crumpled napkins. Another time, a group of teenagers laughed when she dropped a tray, whispering to each other like she wasn't right there. Bet she's been here forever. They weren't wrong. Some days it felt like forever. But she had no choice. Rent was overdue. Groceries didn't buy themselves. The bills stacked up faster than she could keep up, and working extra shifts wasn't a decision. It was survival. She forced smiles, poured coffee, and ignored the ache in her feet. She kept moving because stopping meant thinking, and thinking led to questions she didn't have the luxury to ask. When she finally got a break, it wasn't really a break. Just a moment to breathe before the dinner crowd poured in. She leaned against the counter, pressing her fingers into her temples. Exhaustion settled deep in her bones, but there was no escaping it. She glanced at the clock. 3 more hours to go. Then she'd catch the late bus home, check on Malcolm, and maybe, just maybe, get a few hours of sleep before doing it all over again. She had spent years giving, serving, pushing through, and yet most days it felt like no one even noticed. But today, everything was about to change. The lunch rush had come and gone, leaving behind the usual aftermath, crumbs on the tables, half-empty coffee cups, and the low hum of conversation from a few lingering customers. Tanya wiped her hands on her apron, scanning the room out of habit. That's when she noticed him. Table 9. A man sat alone, shoulders slightly hunched, a worn baseball cap pulled low over his face. He wasn't one of the regulars, nor did he have the hurried air of a traveler just passing through. There was something different about him, something that made Tanya pause. She had seen thousands of faces over the years, yet something about this one felt familiar. But there was no time to wonder. A customer was a customer, and she had a job to do. She grabbed a menu and walked over, her voice steady and professional. Afternoon. Coffee? The man lifted his head slightly, just enough for her to catch a glimpse of his face. His expression was calm, his eyes carrying a quiet weight. There was no impatience, no distraction, just a measured presence, like someone used to being careful with his words. "Yeah, thanks," he said. His voice was even polite. Tanya poured the coffee, setting the cup down without a sound. Most customers would have glanced at the menu, flipped through it absently before deciding. But he didn't. He just sat there, staring into the steam rising from his cup, as if lost in thought. "You need a few minutes?" she asked. He shook his head. "Nah, I'll take the meatloaf, mashed potatoes, no gravy, and green beans if they're fresh." Tanya hesitated. "They're canned." A small, almost imperceptible smile crossed his lips. "Figured. That's fine." She scribbled the order down, feeling an odd urge to say something more, to fill the silence. But she didn't. It wasn't her place. As she turned to walk back to the counter, something tugged at the back of her mind. Where had she seen that face before? Before she could think too hard about it, the front door swung open. The sound of heavy boots against the linoleum made her jaw tighten. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Earl. Loud, obnoxious, always talking too much. He stomped in like he owned the place, headed straight for the counter. "You see who that is?" he muttered, jerking his chin toward table 9. Tanya kept her expression neutral, pretending to focus on a stain she was wiping. "Should I?" Earl leaned in, voice dropping as if he was sharing a secret. "That's J.D. Vance," he whispered. "The politician. Wrote that book about growing up poor. You know, the one they turned into a movie." Tanya's grip on the rag tightened. She had heard the name before. She just hadn't realized it was him. Earl dropped onto a stool at the counter, shaking his head like he had just stumbled onto the biggest news of the year. His voice was low, but not low enough. "You see who that is?" He jerked his thumb toward table 9, eyes wide with the thrill of gossip. Tanya barely glanced up. "Should I?" Earl leaned in, lowering his voice, though his tone still carried across the near-empty diner. "That's J.D. Vance," he said, nodding like she was supposed to be impressed. "The politician. Wrote that book about growing up poor. You know, the one they made into a movie." Tanya wiped the counter, her grip on the rag tightening slightly. She had heard the name before. It had been in the headlines on television. But to her, politicians were just faces on a screen. People who made speeches, shook hands, promised things. They came and went, talking about struggles they had left behind long ago. She stole a glance at table 9. J.D. Vance sat there, quiet, stirring his coffee. He wasn't acting important. He wasn't calling attention to himself. For a moment, Tanya wondered, did he still understand what it felt like to scrape by? To wake up every morning knowing the weight of survival rested on your shoulders? Or had success made all that a distant memory? Earl snorted. "Bet he won't tip. Probably thinks he's too important." Tanya ignored him. She had a plate to serve. But something about this order felt different. J.D. Vance ate in silence. No phone, no distractions, just slow, deliberate movements as he cut into his meal. Tanya had seen countless customers pass through Mason's diner, but few like him. He wasn't in a rush. He didn't check his watch between bites. He wasn't impatiently waving her over for the check. He simply ate, lost in his own thoughts. By the time he finished, most of the lunch crowd had cleared out. The hum of conversation had faded, replaced by the occasional clatter of dishes in the kitchen. Earl had left too, his usual complaints about the world trailing behind him like a bad smell. Tanya was wiping down a nearby table when she heard the soft scrape of a chair against the floor. J.D. Vance stood, reached into his pocket, and placed something under the edge of his empty plate. Then, without a word, he walked out. The bell above the door gave a tired jingle as it swung shut behind him. Tanya sighed, rolling her shoulders before heading to clear the table. She had done this 1,000 times. Pick up the plates, wipe away the crumbs, move on to the next. She wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. Some customers left a few crumpled bills. Some left nothing at all. It didn't matter. Tips were never guaranteed. She reached for the plate and spotted the folded check tucked just underneath. Her fingers hesitated. Most people left cash if they left anything at all. A check was unusual. She unfolded it, expecting maybe $20 or at best $50. But as her eyes scanned the numbers, everything around her seemed to blur. This wasn't 20. It wasn't 50. It was more than she had made in weeks. Her breath caught, fingers tightening around the paper. She felt the diner spin for a second, her knees threatening to buckle. But it wasn't just the amount that left her frozen. It was the message written beside it. For your kindness, for your patience, for the things you've endured that you shouldn't have had to. I see you. I honor you. Thank you for everything you do. Tanya swallowed hard. Her vision blurred, the words smudging as tears burned at the edges of her eyes. When was the last time someone had really looked at her? Not just as a waitress, not just as a worker moving through the motions, but as a person with struggles, exhaustion, and dreams she barely had time to remember. She had spent years serving, giving, sacrificing, and for the first time in what felt like forever, someone had acknowledged it. The check trembled in her grip. She pressed it against her chest for a brief second, letting the words settle deep before tucking it safely into her apron pocket. She wasn't crying over the money, not just the money. It was the fact that someone had seen her. A lump formed in her throat, but she forced herself to breathe, to pull herself together. The diner didn't stop just because her world had shifted. She had tables to wipe, drinks to refill, and hours left on her shift. But as she moved through the motions, something felt different. The exhaustion that had settled into her bones for years felt just a little lighter. The weight of barely getting by had loosened, even if only for a moment. And that did something to her. She glanced toward the door, half expecting Vance to walk back in, to explain, to say something more. But he was gone. The moment had passed, but she would never forget it. Tanya moved through the diner, but everything felt different. The weight she had carried for years didn't press as hard against her shoulders. The exhaustion that usually clung to her like an old coat felt lighter. She still had tables to clear, orders to take, coffee to pour. But her hands weren't as heavy, her steps weren't as slow. At table 4, an elderly man fumbled with a handful of coins, trying to count out exact change for his coffee. Normally, Tanya would wait patiently, watching the seconds tick by, knowing she had a dozen other things to do. Today, she just smiled. "Don't worry about it," she said, slipping a few coins back toward him. "You're good." The man looked up, surprised. "Are you sure?" Tanya nodded. "Yeah. Enjoy your coffee." He thanked her twice before sipping from his cup, a small act of relief washing over his face. At another table, a young couple finished their meal, leaving behind a mess of crumbs and crumpled napkins. Tanya usually sighed when she saw scenes like this. Another thoughtless cleanup, another careless moment from people who didn't think about the person wiping it away. But today, she just grabbed a rag and cleaned the table without a second thought. Marcy, her coworker, grumbled as she passed by. "I swear, people don't even try to be neat." Tanya only shrugged. "They're not thinking about it." Marcy gave her a look. "You feeling okay? You're usually the first one to roll your eyes about this kind of stuff." Tanya hesitated. She could have told her about the check, about the note, about the feeling of finally being seen. Instead, she just smiled. "Guess I'm just in a good mood today." A few minutes later, Marcy groaned, running a hand through her hair. "I got asked to cover the late shift again. I swear, I just did it last week." Tanya wiped down the counter. She thought about all the nights she had begged for extra hours just to keep the lights on. But tonight, for once, she wasn't scrambling. "I'll take it," she said. Marcy blinked. "Wait, really? You never pick up extra shifts unless you have to." Tanya shrugged, tying her apron tighter. "Figured you could use the night off." Marcy studied her for a second before shaking her head. "Well, I won't argue with that." Tanya just smiled, but deep down, she knew something had changed. It wasn't just about the money. It wasn't even just about the note. It was about what it meant to be seen. And now she wanted to pass that feeling on. Tanya stepped out of the diner, the night air cool against her skin. Normally, after a long shift, she would head straight home, her feet aching, her body desperate for rest. But tonight, something pulled her in a different direction. She turned the corner toward Everett's Grocery, the small store she had been going to for years. It wasn't the cheapest place in town, but Miss Dottie, the cashier, had always been kind. She had let Tanya buy on credit more times than she could count, never once making her feel ashamed for it. Tonight, though, Tanya wasn't here to ask for favors. She grabbed a basket and moved through the aisles, picking up the usual milk, eggs, bread. But then she hesitated. She reached for a bag of fresh fruit, something she usually skipped. Then, a box of Malcolm's favorite granola bars. And finally, on impulse, a chocolate cake from the bakery section. Something just for them. At the register, Miss Dottie peered at her over her glasses. "Bit more than usual today," she said, her hands moving steadily as she rang everything up. Tanya just smiled and pulled out the check. "Not a problem tonight." Miss Dottie glanced at the paper, then back at her, her face softening. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. Instead, she bagged the groceries and said, "Good for you, honey." Tanya stepped outside, shifting the weight of the bags in her arms. That's when she saw them. A woman sat on the curb, her arms wrapped tightly around a little girl who had curled up beside her. The child's small fingers clutched at her mother's sleeve, her head resting against her shoulder. Tanya slowed her steps. She could walk past, pretend she didn't see them, tell herself someone else would help. But she knew better. Most people didn't stop. Most people looked away. She adjusted the bags and walked over. The woman glanced up, her eyes tired, guarded. Without a word, Tanya knelt down and placed a bag beside her. "Here," she said softly. "Some food for you and your little one." The woman blinked, as if unsure whether to accept. Then, slowly, her fingers tightened around the bag. Her lips parted, but for a moment, no words came out. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick. "Thank you." Tanya nodded. "I know how hard it is." She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. As she walked away, something inside her felt lighter. Tonight, she wasn't just surviving. Tonight, for the first time in a long time, she had enough to give. Tanya drove home in silence, the weight of the day settling differently in her chest. Not the usual exhaustion. Not the familiar pressure of barely making it through. This was something else. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. She parked outside the apartment, grabbing the grocery bags. The hallway light flickered like it always did, casting long shadows as she climbed the stairs. When she stepped inside, Malcolm looked up from the couch. His eyes landed on the cake in her hands, his brows lifting in surprise. "You got cake?" he asked, like he almost didn't believe it. Tanya set the bags on the counter and smiled. "Yeah, thought we deserved something special tonight." Malcolm didn't question it. He just grabbed plates, already cutting into the soft layers. As he worked, Tanya reached into her apron pocket, pulling out the folded check. Her fingers traced over the words, their meaning sinking in all over again. "I see you. I honor you." For years, she had given, served, and endured without acknowledgement. Tonight, that changed. Tomorrow, she would still wake before dawn. She would still walk through the diner doors. She would still take orders from people who barely looked up. But she would never feel invisible again. And maybe, just maybe, she would make sure someone else didn't feel that way either. If this story meant something to you, take a moment today to truly see someone. A kind word, a simple gesture, or even a moment of patience can change a person's day in ways you may never realize. So often, people move through life unnoticed, carrying burdens no one asks about. But kindness, no matter how small, has the power to remind them that they matter. Be the reason someone feels seen today. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. Because sometimes the smallest acts leave the deepest impact.